I found the sticky note stuck to the cabin door before I even set my bag down. My name, written in blue marker, right under a man's name I didn't recognize yet but would spend the rest of that week unable to stop thinking about. Not the guest loft. Not the bunk room with the kids. The same cabin bedroom. And when I asked why, nobody in that family even bothered pretending it was an accident. Welcome back to our channel. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 28, I work as a physical therapist in a mid-sized city in Colorado, and until that August, the most reckless thing I'd done all year was order the spicy ramen instead of the mild one. I liked my life quiet. I liked routines. My best friend Megan Foster liked to remind me, at every opportunity, that quiet and boring were not actually synonyms, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. Megan and I met in nursing school, back when I still thought I wanted to be a nurse before I switched tracks halfway through my second year. She was the one who talked me through the switch, who sat with me at 2 in the morning while I panicked about wasted tuition money, who told me that changing your mind wasn't failure, it was just information. We'd been inseparable for 6 years since. She was made of honor material before either of us had anyone worth marrying, and I told her so more than once, usually after too much wine. So when she called me in July, practically vibrating through the phone, and told me her family had rented a cabin up near Estes Park for the second week of August, and that I had to come, no excuses, I didn't hesitate. I said yes before she'd even finished laying out the dates. It's the whole family, she added. My parents, my aunt, my cousin Lily, and Jake's coming too. Jake. Her older brother. I'd met him exactly twice in 6 years of friendship, both times briefly, both times leaving me with a distinct and slightly embarrassing memory of a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of an outdoor gear catalog and somehow also seemed genuinely nice about it, which felt unfair. I hadn't thought about him in months. Mostly. Sounds fun, I said. The more the merrier. Right, Megan said, and there was something in the way she said it, a little too quick, a little too breezy, that I should have caught. I didn't. I packed my bags with the kind of uncomplicated excitement you only get before you understand what you've actually agreed to. A week in the mountains, away from patient charts and insurance calls and the general hum of my regular life. What could possibly go wrong? The Foster family cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, tucked against a hillside of pine trees so dense the whole place smelled like Christmas even in August. It was bigger than a cabin had any right to be, log-sided, with a wraparound deck and a view of the mountains that made me stop walking the second I got out of the car. Megan's mother, Karen, came down the porch steps in a flannel shirt and hiking boots and pulled me into a hug that smelled like coffee and campfire smoke. "Sarah, honey, look at you," she said, holding me back by the shoulders like she was inspecting a prize heifer at the county fair. "You look wonderful." "Hi, Mrs. Foster." "Karen," she corrected, the way she always did, the way I always forgot. Megan's father, Tom, was already at the fire pit arranging logs with the focused seriousness of a man who considered firebuilding a competitive sport. Megan's cousin Lily, 14 and permanently attached to her phone, sat cross-legged on the porch swing. And coming up from the shed with an armful of firewood, sleeves pushed up, was Jake. He looked up when the gravel crunched under our tires. For 1 second, neither of us said anything. It had been a while. He wasn't quite the polite stranger from those 2 brief meetings anymore. He was 32 now, sun-browned from what was clearly a summer spent outdoors, with the kind of easy, unhurried confidence that made a person seem like they'd never once worried about being late for anything in their life. "Sarah," he said, like he was testing the sound of my name to make sure it still fit. "It's been a minute." "It has," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, which I counted as a small personal victory. We carried bags inside. The cabin smelled like cedar and whatever Karen had simmering on the stove. She gave the tour with the enthusiasm of someone who'd clearly given this exact tour a dozen times before, pointing out the kitchen, the great room, the loft, and finally, the bedrooms down the back hallway. "Lily's in the bunk room with the twin beds," Karen said. "Tom and I are up front. Megan, you're in the room across from us." She paused at the last door, the one at the end of the hall with a window looking straight out at the mountain, and smiled in a way that should have told me everything. "And Sarah, you and Jake are in here." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, the kind mothers make to fluster their grown children. Jake did not laugh. "Mom," he said. "There are 2 beds," Karen said breezily, already halfway down the hall. "It's the only room with enough space since I promised Lily she could have her own this year. You're both adults. You'll manage." "There's a futon in the loft," Jake said. "That futon has a metal bar running straight through the middle of it, and your father's snoring carries through these walls like we're living in a tin can," Karen called back without stopping. "You'll be fine." She disappeared around the corner before either of us could push back, which I would come to understand was Karen Foster's signature move. Announce the plan, walk away before objections could gather steam, let logistics finish the argument for her. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag still on my shoulder, looking at the sticky note taped above one of the pillows. My name, in Karen's handwriting, directly beside Jake's. 2 beds, technically. Separated by maybe 5 feet of hardwood floor and a nightstand with a lamp shaped like a bear. Same room. Same window. Same 7 days. Jake set his bag down slowly, like he needed the extra seconds to figure out what to say. "I'm really sorry about this," he said finally. "She's been asking about you since May." "About me?" "You have no idea." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that did something unhelpful to my composure. "I can take the futon. Metal bar and all. I've slept on worse during backpacking trips." "It's fine," I said, and mostly meant it, even though my pulse was doing something distinctly not fine. "It's your family's cabin. I'm not booting you out of your own room over a piece of furniture that sounds like a medieval torture device." He looked at me a beat too long. "Okay," he said. "Okay. 2 beds. We're adults about it." "We're adults," I repeated, as if saying it twice would settle the matter. Dinner that first night was out on the deck, string lights strung along the railing, the mountains fading from gold to deep blue as the sun dropped behind the peaks. Tom told a long story about a bear that had gotten into their cooler 2 summers back, a story that grew visibly larger with every detail he added. Lily rolled her eyes but laughed anyway. Megan kept catching my gaze across the table with an expression somewhere between guilty and hopeful. I finally cornered her in the kitchen while we scraped plates, the men still out on the deck arguing about whether the bear story had crossed into folklore. "You knew," I said quietly. "About the room." Megan at least had the decency to look sheepish. "I found out an hour before you got here, I swear. My mom mentioned it like a footnote. Oh, by the way, you and your brother's friend are sharing." Like she was talking about the weather forecast. "Megan. She's not subtle, Sarah, you know this about her. She's been asking about you every single time I talk to her since I mentioned you were single last spring. Her exact words were, and I quote, 'That girl is exactly the kind of steady influence Jake needs instead of spending every free weekend up a mountain by himself.' I dried a plate slower than necessary, buying myself a second. So this whole trip is a setup." "The trip is a real vacation," Megan said. "The room is my mother taking some creative liberties with the sleeping arrangements." She glanced at me sideways. "Would that really be so terrible? You liked him." I remember. You asked me about him for a week straight after that barbecue 2 years ago and then pretended you didn't. I asked one time. You asked for times and disguised it as small talk each time. I didn't have a good comeback for that, mostly because she wasn't wrong. That first night, I lay in the dark in an unfamiliar bed 5 feet away from a man I barely knew, listening to some kind of owl calling from somewhere out in the pines, thinking about how thoroughly a person's family could complicate things without ever once raising their voice. You still awake? Jake's voice came out of the dark, careful, testing whether I wanted to talk at all. Yeah. For what it's worth, he said, I really am sorry about my mom. She means well. She's just never met a boundary she didn't consider optional. I laughed, and something in the room loosened. Megan used almost that exact phrase. We grew up in the same house. We've both given up trying to redirect her at this point. A pause. Is this weird for you? I mean it about the futon. Metal bar's not that bad. It's not weird, I said, which was mostly a lie, and then, because the dark makes people more honest than daylight ever does, I added, okay, it's a little weird. Not a bad weird, though. There was a silence that felt like it was doing something. Not a bad weird, he repeated softly. I can live with that. The next morning, Karen had the whole day mapped out before any of us had finished our coffee. A hike up to the overlook, a stop at the general store in town, then a campfire after dinner. She announced it with the confidence of a woman who had never once had a plan derailed simply because someone wasn't on board. I already sorted out the hiking pairs, she said, sliding a printed itinerary across the counter like she was handing out battle assignments. Sarah, you're with Jake, since he knows the trail and you're new to the altitude and someone should keep an eye on you. Mom, Megan said, you could just admit you want them to spend time together. I could, Karen agreed pleasantly, already moving toward the door, but this way nobody has to feel embarrassed about it. Jake caught my eye across the kitchen and mouthed sorry, again. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I wasn't actually bothered. The trail that morning cut up through a stand of aspens still holding onto morning's shadow, the air thin and sharp in a way that made my lungs work harder than they were used to. Jake walked slightly ahead, setting an easy pace, pointing out where the trail narrowed near a rockslide from years back, where a stream cut across the path and you had to hop the stones just right or end up soaked to the knee. You've gone quiet, he said, after a while. Taking it all in, I said. It's beautiful up here. It is. He looked out toward the valley instead of at me, which somehow made what he said next land harder. I used to come up here every summer as a kid and think it was the one place that never changed no matter what was going on down in the real world. Everything else moves. This mountain just sits here being exactly what it is. That's a good way to think about a place. I've had time to work it out. He hesitated. The job I do, it's not always easy to unplug from. I work search and rescue on the weekends, on top of my regular gig doing trail maintenance for the Forest Service. You see a lot up here that stays with you. This mountain's the only place that makes the noise in my head go quiet instead of just louder. I didn't answer right away, because it felt like he'd handed me something delicate and I didn't want to fumble it by rushing. I get that, in my own smaller way, I finally said. Physical therapy's not the same kind of weight you're carrying, not even close, but some days I come home and can't stand the sound of my own phone ringing. My apartment's my version of this mountain, I guess. Just with worse scenery and considerably more traffic noise. That earned a real laugh out of him, low and easy, and something about hearing it made the whole morning feel different, warmer, like we'd stepped past polite catching up into something closer to actual honesty. We got back to the cabin a full hour after everyone else, and when we reached the porch, Karen was standing there with a coffee mug and an expression of such obvious satisfaction that Megan, beside her, had to physically cover her own face. "Have a nice time?" Karen asked, sweet as pie. "Mom," Jake said, setting down his pack, "you are not subtle." "I have never once claimed to be subtle," Karen said. "Subtlety is for people who aren't sure what they actually want." The trip into town that afternoon should have been uneventful, except for Brittany Cole. Brittany was a family friend, someone the Fosters had known for years through the local trail running club Jake belonged to. She spotted us outside the general store, waved at Karen with the enthusiasm of long familiarity, and turned to Jake with a smile that had clearly been rehearsed for exactly this moment. "Jake Foster," she said. "I heard you'd be up here this week. I've been meaning to catch up." "Brittany. Good to see you." He was friendly, easy, the way he was with most people, but I noticed he didn't linger the way she was clearly hoping he might. Her eyes moved to me, cataloging, the way some women do when they're sizing up whether you're a threat. "And you are?" "Sarah. Megan's friend." "Right," Brittany said, and something in her tone turned the word into a small dismissal, a reminder that I was a guest in a story that had started long before I showed up. "Megan's friend. That's nice." Later, back at the cabin, Brittany found her way onto the porch where I was sitting with a glass of iced tea and dropped into the chair beside me like she owned it. "Can I be honest with you?" she said, not waiting for permission. "Jake and I have history. Nothing official, but everyone up here has watched us circle each other for years. His whole family adores me." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You're leaving in a week." "I live 20 minutes from here." I set my tea down slowly. "I appreciate the honesty," I said, "but I don't really plan my week around who's staying longer in a town I don't live in." Her smile flickered. "I'm just saying. Karen's been engineering this room situation for months. She does this with everyone who comes through." That told me something useful. Brittany had noticed the exact same thing I had, that this whole trip had been arranged, and it bothered her enough to stake her claim before dinner was even on the table. "Noted," I said, and picked my tea back up. After a silence that clearly wasn't landing how she'd hoped, she excused herself. That night at the campfire, the whole family gathered around the flames, sparks lifting into a sky thick with stars in a way that made the mountains feel closer than they were. Tom told another version of the bear story. Lily finally set her phone down long enough to roast marshmallows. Megan sat close to me, nudging my shoulder every time Jake glanced our way, which was more often than could reasonably be called casual. Brittany had been invited to stay for the fire too, apparently a standing tradition, and planted herself directly beside Jake with a closeness that seemed obvious to everyone except Jake himself, who kept subtly angling his body away from her without appearing to notice. At one point she laughed loudly and rested her hand on his forearm. I watched him gently shift his weight so the contact broke naturally. No scene, no confrontation, just a quiet redirection that told me exactly where his attention actually was. Later, once the fire had burned to embers and most of the family had drifted back inside, Jake and I ended up walking the tree line together, pine needles soft under our boots, the night air carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. "Brittany's a lot," I said, before I could stop myself. Jake laughed, surprised. "She's been a lot since we were in high school together. My mom's convinced we're supposed to end up together because our families go way back. I've never once seen it that way." He glanced over. "Did she say something to you?" "She gave me a full breakdown of her seniority." "That sounds exactly like her." He shook his head. "I'm sorry. This trip is turning into an awful lot of apologizing on my part." "You don't owe apologies for other people's behavior," I said. You're not responsible for your mother's planning or Brittany's timeline. He stopped walking. The moon was bright enough that I could see his face clearly, and there was something in his expression that felt like the edge of a decision being made. "Can I say something?" he said. "And I need you to know it's not because my mom put us in the same room, or because Brittany got territorial today, or because it's a clear night on a mountain and it would be easy to say something like this under exactly these circumstances." "Okay," I said, my heart doing something complicated. "I remembered you," he said. "From that barbecue 2 years ago. You asked me more real questions about search and rescue work than anyone at that whole party, questions that weren't just polite, that actually meant something. I thought about that conversation more than I probably should have for someone I'd only just met. I wasn't trying to make an impression," I said. "I was actually curious." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why it stuck with me. You weren't performing interest. You genuinely had it." He looked out at the dark shape of the mountain. "When Megan told me you were coming this week, I was more excited than I wanted to admit, even to myself. Even knowing your mom had already picked our room." That got a Rael laugh, warm and low. "Especially knowing that. It meant I didn't have to be the one to figure out how to get you alone." I let the word settle for a moment, the quiet of the trees filling the space in a way that felt comfortable instead of awkward. "For what it's worth," I said finally, "I thought about that barbecue too. More than I probably should have for someone I only asked one round of questions." His eyebrows lifted. "One round? Don't let it go to your head." "Too late," he said, and the smile that spread across his face was the first fully unguarded one I'd seen from him all week. "We didn't kiss that night. It felt too soon, too easy, too much like handing his mother a victory neither of us wanted her to have quite yet. But we walked back slower than we needed to, and when we said goodnight in the hallway outside our shared room, there was a pause that lasted a beat too long, both of us clearly aware of what wasn't happening yet, and both of us okay with the waiting. The rest of the week unfolded in small, accumulating moments. Jake teaching me to identify birdsong on the porch at dawn, standing close enough that his shoulder brushed mine and neither of us moved away. A rainy afternoon of cards with the whole family, Jake and I on the same team, winning 3 straight hands and getting Tom to accuse us, good-naturedly, of some kind of secret signal system. A late-night talk on the deck after everyone else had gone to bed, blankets pulled around our shoulders, trading real things, his work, my patience. The ways we'd both learned to carry weight quietly instead of asking for help. Brittany made one more appearance, showing up uninvited to a family dinner with a six-pack and a determination that read from across the room. She spent the meal steering conversation toward Jake, bringing up old trail races and a wedding they'd both attended the previous fall, transparently reminding the table, and specifically me, that her claim came first. It was Karen, of all people, who finally addressed it once dinner had wound down and Brittany had stepped away to take a phone call. "I love that girl like family," Karen said quietly, refilling my water glass without being asked, "but I've watched her chase my son for over a decade, and I've watched him stay polite about it out of habit more than anything. I've watched for 6 days say exactly what you think. That's rarer than people realize. Karen. I put you two in that room on purpose, Sarah. I'll own that fully. I'm not sorry. But I wasn't just throwing darts blindly. I've heard about you from Megan for years. I know you drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to sit with her the week her grandmother passed. A mother notices things like that, even secondhand." She patted my hand and stood to gather plates. "I just wanted the two of you under one roof long enough to actually see each other. What happens after that is entirely up to you two." I sat there for a moment, unexpectedly moved by the bluntness of it, by the total absence of apology in a confession most people would have softened. On the last full evening of the trip, Jake found me sitting alone on a boulder near the tree line, watching the sun drop behind the ridge in long streaks of orange and pink. 7 days went by fast, he said, settling down beside me. Too fast, I agreed. I don't want this to just be a vacation thing, he said, no preamble, direct in the exact way I'd come to recognize as entirely his own. I don't want to go back to our regular lives and let this turn into a nice memory neither of us ever does anything with. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to see you somewhere that isn't a mountain, where my mom isn't assigning bedrooms and Brittany isn't showing up uninvited with beer. I want to know if this holds up in a parking lot on a Tuesday. He looked at me, something almost vulnerable in it, a man who was clearly used to saying hard things plainly and still found this one difficult. I know it's only been a week. I don't think that changes anything I already know. I live 2 hours from here, I said. I drive for a living, more or less, he said. Different kind of driving, same basic principle. I laughed and reached for his hand, and he laced his fingers through mine like we'd already done it 100 times instead of for the first time. Okay, I said. Let's find out if it holds up on a Tuesday. He kissed me then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that had clearly been building since a barbecue 2 years earlier and had simply been waiting for both of us to catch up to it. We drove home separately 2 days later, but he called before I'd even hit the interstate. He came down the following weekend, and the one after that. 3 months later, Brittany quietly stopped showing up at family gatherings whenever I was mentioned as attending, which nobody but Karen seemed to comment on, and even she only did it with a raised eyebrow and a small, satisfied smile. A year later, Karen invited me back to the cabin for Labor Day, and when I walked in, there was a sticky note above the pillow in that same room from the summer before. This time it just said my name. Jake's was already written beside it in the same blue marker, and this time neither of us bothered pretending to be surprised. 2 years after that, Jake proposed on that same boulder at the tree line, right as the sun hit that same streak of orange, and when I said yes, I could hear Karen clapping from the porch, having clearly been watching the whole thing from the kitchen window with an anticipation she'd never once bothered to hide. We got married the following July at the cabin, under a canopy strung between 2 pines close enough to hear the wind moving through them the whole ceremony. Megan was my maid of honor. Brittany, to everyone's mild surprise, came, even danced once with Jake's cousin, and seemed, finally, to have made peace with a story that had never really been hers to write. At the reception, Karen found me near the dessert table and pulled me into a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual. I told you, she said. That room was never really about logistics. I figured that out eventually, I said. Most people don't figure out what's good for them until someone puts it right next to their pillow, she said, and walked off to go argue with the band about the song list, leaving me standing there laughing at a woman who had, in her own thoroughly unsubtle way, handed me the best thing that had ever happened to me. What would you have done if you showed up for a family vacation and discovered your best friend's parents had already picked your room for you? Would you have pushed back, or let the plan run its course? And have you ever had someone else see something true about your life before you were ready to admit it yourself? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.